Wow, what a day. Thanks to Howard and his team. I've heard so much and learned so much about different perspectives on wisdom I wouldn't have dreamt of. And so now I'm standing here and I'm thinking, what else could I now add to this whole day? And so I had given at one point in preparing this title. And so as I was listening to the day, I actually changed what I'm going to say under this title. And so I hope you find it still interesting at the end of the day. So improving wisdom, as I heard all of you speak today, may have at least 3 different meanings for us today. And the first one is that we may want to ponder about how we can improve actually wisdom research as a field. And the second one is, obviously, that's the obvious one for us as psychologists. We want to improve wisdom in individuals. And I can talk a little bit about that. And finally, maybe we can also improve wisdom beyond individuals. Actually, maybe we can contribute to something about as grand as the future of humankind and tackling and trying to provide some help in tackling the big issues of societies. So that's my 3 improvements for wisdom. So the first one. So maybe this is some common ground that I can offer here, and to talk about a basic conceptualization of wisdom that may or may not cut across different disciplines and different paradigms, for us to agree upon that obviously there is an insight component that comes with wisdom, which refers to the breadth and depth of insight into self and others and the world, but also into the limits of that insight. And it, very importantly, it includes this continuous, what I've called technically updating. Some of you have called it learning from mistakes, correcting ourselves. So this is this insight. And then the second big component has to do with self-regulation and emotion regulation. And it revolves around choosing the right measure at the right time, having algorithms for that. And it also, with regard to emotion, it refers to enduring complexity of emotional states in the sense of being able to face sadness without being overwhelmed by it and not having to push it away, being able to learn from sadness, and at the same time being able to be happy. So this is what I mean with complexity. And the third very crucial component, which I think makes them wisdom research different from pure reasoning research or pure social cognition research or pure emotion research, it has to come with a certain value orientation, and that value orientation starts with a self-transcendence, but that's not all, as we discussed today already. It has to be a self-transcendence with the goal to balance one's own well-being with that of others, as Sternberg called it, but then even more, it has to have this will and orientation towards transcending the given in this world, so towards a betterment, towards an improvement, towards an upward spiral. And the final one, which I think we have not done good justice so far in research at all, it's the action regulation. It's just very hard to study, and so when or when not to act, when it comes to our own lives, and to give advice when it comes to general wisdom to help others in their difficult and dilemma-like life situations. So maybe these are 4 components that might define a common ground for all of us. I don't know. I would advocate for the field of wisdom research, hopefully for an improvement, to push for more performance-based measures, a need for real-life paradigms when we want to grasp behaviors, actions. I think we need to make major steps towards studying fundamental processes, and this is carrying close to Newcastle. I know we are here close to the neurosciences, and we really need to take our creativity and break the complexity of our phenomenon down to the fundamental processes if we want to better understand it and be eventually better able to intervene. And I deeply believe in a need to join forces to make progress, and it can only come from cumulative efforts. And so that's why I think today's workshop serves a very important purpose, and maybe gradually, if maybe there's some continuity to this kind of exchange, we can find this common ground and maybe even agree on common paradigms so that more invest in the same paradigm so that we can accumulate. It's not by chance that, for instance, cognitive psychology and cognitive neuroscience has made so much progress in the recent years. It's because they have come to an agreement and they are studying phenomenon using the same paradigms with minute differentiations. Second, so to improve wisdom in individuals, we've heard a little bit about it. Igor talked about it, and Jeffrey Vesper talked about it, and we heard about a very admirable intervention program that you are developing for medical doctors. So there's a lot out there. Let me just give you our approach to that over the last decades. So I think we can learn about improving wisdom from two different things. One is to study interindividual differences. And the second is actually to try to achieve intra-individual differences. So when we look at inter-individual differences, we have at the very beginning when Paul Baltus and I set out to study wisdom in Berlin in the 80s and 90s, we came up with this ontogenetic model of wisdom, which starts out from our definition. I'm not recapitulating that, but these were the three big factors and resources that we define to be feeding into this system to develop something like wisdom-related judgment and insight. It's person characteristics. At the top, you see the most important ones, which revolve around creativity and a type of cognitive style, in particular the judiciousness, as Sternberg measured this in his cognitive styles inventory, the psychological mindedness, it's this perspective taking, and the continued openness to experience, which is so effortful. And we don't like to stay open, actually. And then the second big piece is the experiences. Obviously, we heard great stories today about traumatic experiences, everyday experiences. Without experiences, we cannot develop anything that comes close. But we also need practice in dealing with that. And it may be helpful to have mentorship, to have someone to turn to refer to, and to learn how to deal with these experiences in order to form insights from these experiences. And to keep us on this track, there needs a certain motivational disposition. It's a strive for digging deeper, a strive for excellence that keeps us going against all odds. And it's what we found in our most recent work is also this notion of generativity, to think beyond our own generation into the future. Finally, we haven't heard much about that, but we also thought that this is really crucial, and that is macrostructural contexts. So I think different historical times have more or less conduciveness to help individuals to develop wisdom. Age periods bring their own challenges to help us. Different professions, we heard about the medical profession. There are other professions that bring us very close to life hardships. And finally, I think even beyond that, value systems in a society, infrastructure that is provided in a society can help facilitate or actually debilitate wisdom-related development. And this has to feed through organizing processes. We have specified three: one oriented towards the future, the life planning processes; one oriented towards the past, we heard a lot about life review; and finally, the life management and life decision making. So what did we find based on this model? We first found that age has a non-significant relationship. We talked about that. That goes even back into Buddhist and theological traditions. It's not chronological age. We found that intelligence per se is not what does it. It's a minimal amount, 2% unique variance that we need in order to make progress. Personality traits per se, even openness and personal growth, a unique contribution only of 2%. The major force within the person, it was the personality-intelligence interface, creativity and cognitive style. It carried 13% unique variance. And on the other side, life experiences was the other big chunk in the predictive pattern. And it's general life experiences, but also profession-specific experiences. We did work with clinical psychologists and medical practitioners where we found that they had, as compared to control groups, higher levels of life insight. Now, moral reasoning is also something that may come to mind, and we found in one study, when we enter it, after all the variables that I mentioned, there is no unique variance by the traditional measures of moral reasoning based on the Colbert approach that is added. Intra-individual differences. It's basically the question whether we can change that curve, right? That's what it is. So we tried multiple things. There was mentioned before that we tried an interactive minds paradigm because maybe wisdom is too grand for one person, for one mind, for one soul. And we went by saying, okay, others help us to retrieve knowledge. They support cognitive deficiencies. So they help us to change our minds, to modify. And actually quite often as we talk to others, we get new ideas. They are stimulating. But we should not forget talking to others, being with others can also be detrimental. It derails our train of thought. It actually, sometimes we are competitive and we don't want the other person to have the better idea. So it's not only pros, there are also cons in working with others. And so that's why we put out that paradigm, which compared a dialogue situation with a natural partner with our standard one-person situation, an individual thinking time as a control condition, a virtual dialogue where we told people just think what another person might say rather than having the person in the room, and finally a dialogue situation, and after the dialogue, before the person gave the individual response to our wisdom dilemmas, they had an appraisal time. And what we found was that there was an effect size of 11% in performance increase for the dialogue and individual appraisal, as well as the virtual dialogue, as compared to the other conditions. And it shows that we can counterbalance the drawbacks of a social interaction if we give the individual some time to sort out everything after the dialogue. So that was for us an interesting finding. We also found that as we get older, there was an age interaction effect. As we get older, we get better able to profit from others. We become less competitive. We actually are better able to pick the raisins from what we hear and make a good judgment of what are the raisins and feed it into our own responses, our own judgments. Now, interesting, this was general wisdom. When we come to personal wisdom, so how we can be insightful about our own problem, we went about the same way. This time we had also dialogue and alone conditions, and we brought in additionally a life review intervention, basically to support people in this life reflection process that we talked so much about it today. And we found something very, very interesting. In the case of personal wisdom, it is not the dialogue with a natural partner that helps us to make progress, but it's the life review intervention per se, whether we do it alone or with someone else. And we interpreted this to say that there is good reason why in clinical settings we actually have a foreigner, a therapeutist who works with us, because with a known other, we have established taboos and we have established ways of seeing each other. So at a certain point we become not truly helpful anymore for the deep issues that may help to promote our pathway towards personal wisdom. So, excuse me? So it's young and old, and they had a life review intervention in dialogue setting, life review intervention alone. They had a reminiscence intervention alone, and thinking time alone. And the hypothesis was that the dialogue life review intervention should be the best, because it brings together two minds and it supports the life reflection process, which we know is so crucial. But what we found that the life review dialogue and alone, they are not significantly different. The difference comes from the life review, to encourage people to not only remember, like in reminiscence, but to actually figure out what happened, try to explain, and try to evaluate and to make it part of a whole, which seems to be making the difference. That's what that graph says. And there are no age differences to talk about. Now, we did another intervention study to focus on one dimension of our wisdom model, which is value relativism. We thought, well, it might be nice to have a world with more tolerance around. Wouldn't that be nice? And so we developed this strategy where we told people, it was basically an instruction. Imagine you sit on a cloud and you travel around the world and you have a difficult life dilemma in your hand, and at 5 stops around the world you think what that life dilemma might mean in a given country. This was an intervention. It took 30 minutes, travel around the world. After these 30 minutes they were given a different life dilemma, and then these answers were coded for value relativism as compared to a control group that did not have that travel on the cloud strategy learned. And we see that this little intervention makes a difference in value relativism to stimulate perspective taking. Obviously, this is not a lasting effect. It only can come about if people apply the strategy. So my final point, improving wisdom by making use of what we know from our wisdom research to make a difference in the world. And I think there are lots of global challenges: sustainability issue, climate issues, longer lives, global demographic change, increasing inequalities. And we might want to start to think about which types of societies and for which reason may be more facilitative and helpful to find orientation and help to make behavior changes that help us to grapple with these global challenges. And so maybe are we in a position as wisdom researchers to make a contribution to define measurable societal indicators that help us to create rankings around the world, to actually create a benchmarking that doesn't follow economic indicators only, but actually indicators of facilitating more wisdom and more wise behaviors in a society. Maybe that is a nice challenge to take on. And with that, I'm thanking, and I'm just showing some people that I'm very grateful to. Thank you.
Questions? Patrick?
Hi, thank you for your talk. You mentioned that life experiences accounted for a large amount of variation in your wisdom outcomes. I was wondering if you could speak more to what specific life experiences those might be.
So the way we measured this is we started out with the Doran-Venn scale, critical life events, and then we built that up to cover the whole lifespan, cover different life phases, and it had 2 dimensions. So there were lists of events, and it was given to people, and they had to answer 2 questions: whether they experienced the event, and then in a second question they were asked whether they felt that this event created additional life insight for them. And what went into this analysis was actually just the summation of the insight-related events. So they created. So we did not look at individual events, but we went with the person's judgment, which of these events that they ticked created more insight for them.
Boaz?
Thank you. I wanted to ask about the idea of improving wisdom, which has been floating around throughout the day. And it struck me that I think every idea is very much anchored in every idea of how to improve wisdom is related to, looks like a wisdom. In other words, we try, if you know, it is intuitively related to what wisdom should be like. So maybe improving wisdom would not look like wisdom at all. Maybe it's much more effective to have sex. Maybe it's much more effective to have sugar. Plunge into the lake when it's really, really, really cold. Or incarceration. I don't know.
No.
Yeah, no incarceration. This is a much more general question about prescription as opposed to understanding a phenomenon.
Oh,
right?
definitely.
You can understand something.
Yeah.
It doesn't mean at all that you have a tool to try and prescribe a change.
Oh yeah, I mean, I think what's of interest to me, I don't know about the others today, you were referring to the whole day, I can only speak for myself. I think as a psychologist trying to grasp this elusive phenomenon of wisdom it's a natural and logical step after you conceptualize it, you measure it, you validate it, you find you can measure it reliably, and then you identify group differences, and then the next step is, can I move it around in one person? With that, I do not prescribe anything. I'm basically interested in trying to find out how can I move around that person, or can I not do it, and what are the mechanisms? And so in the very beginning, when I said to improve wisdom research, you may remember, I think we are at a stage where we have collected lots and lots of evidence. We know a lot, but we know very little yet about the mechanisms. And that's why I said we need to become more fundamental in the underlying, in the underpinnings. So what is it that in certain people, they just deal differently with emotions than others? And so it could be they have a different diet, you know? I mean, we just don't know. We just don't know. And that's, I would perfectly agree with you. And for me, that's a next step.
So Valerie and
Oh,
then
and actually,
Nancy.
maybe to add one last point, I actually would say, and have said so before, that a society of the wise would be awful. And actually, a society of the wise is a juxtaposition in itself, because the wise is defined to be the rare event, and it can only, I've learned about some experimental communities in India that have set out to become a society of the wise, and they have given themselves rules and everything, and they were of the best nature. They were of a Buddhist belief, and they practiced their faith and everything. They actually ended in deep hatred. And I think one thing that when you read the traditional wisdom literature, it's always that within a society, people turn to the few individuals for orientation and advice. And what would it be if we were just then starting basically on the next level to compete for? So it's just, it doesn't work. So when I'm saying improving, I mean maybe some of the components that may make us a bit wiser, and that may actually be living together on this planet, a better project and a better undertaking, rather than, a society of the wise.
I really appreciated your comments about how to improve the field and your recommendations for future research. I think that's something, I don't know what psychologists are like, but in philosophy I don't think we do that enough, partly because we're such individualists. We're nuts. Thanks, Nancy. So I wanted to ask you about the last point you made about the need to join forces to create cumulative knowledge, and to have that happen, people have to agree about terms, and the terms of the debate, at least certain of them have to be common across different projects. And I guess I just want to know how optimistic you are about that. I think I've tried to, I and a few others have tried in philosophy to nudge people who are studying well-being to use terms consistently, to absolutely no effect whatsoever. So I guess I'm hoping it's better in psychology, and I'm wondering whether you feel good about this.
I don't know. I mean, I put it out there because it's so obvious, and it's very nagging to me, when you do this over decades, and you just see it's not coming together, and we are not really making the next major steps. So I would have the hope that we find at least some individuals in the wisdom researchers community that are willing to do that and to join forces and to go the next steps together, and maybe deciding on one or two paradigms and using that in various labs. I think we are at a good stage right now to do that. It would not encompass everyone, obviously, because we, not only philosophers, are individualistic, it's psychologists as well. So.
Nancy.
First, thank you very much for your remarks and your questions throughout the day, which I found very valuable. I want to go on record as voting for sex and sugar as ways of promoting wisdom. But apart from that, I think at a couple of points during the day, you've mentioned your belief that in wise people, their neurophysiological architecture and processes are different.
Yes.
That they're formed in a certain way. And I wonder, number one, why you think that, and number two, what are the factors that you think shape those processes and mechanisms?
Yeah. Well, that's a big question. I can only start a little answer to that. So why do I believe this? Because when we look developmentally across the lifespan, what happens on average with growing older is that we become better to master the vicissitudes of everyday life, and we become better in maintaining our subjective well-being in an hedonistic sense, so measured like as life satisfaction. And that is all good. And it seems when we look into the well-being literature, subjective well-being literature, that there seems to be something like an evolutionary set point of our well-being, which is in the moderate positive realm, just a little bit above the theoretical mean of the scale. That seems hardwired. So we seem to be reverting to that. And to do that, our psyche is knitted in a certain way. So we are great in doing social comparisons that allow us to make us feel good. We are great in changing our levels of aspiration if we cannot reach the higher goal. So we are just very inventive and creative. And I'm not saying this in an intentional way. I think it comes to people as they are faced with these challenges. So that's where I think we have a certain hardwiring for this resilience of our self-system that makes us come out, in most cases, except for big trauma, in most cases on the moderately positive side. And that's why I think there has to be, in the same way, a departure from that hardwiring in some individuals, for whatever reasons. I'm not saying that it is genetic or anything. It could be, early on interactions with certain environments or whatever. That's what gave me this idea. And plus, I think in particular, when we look to emotion regulation, there is this big push to do away with negative experiences, to save ourselves from sorrows, from mistakes, from failures. And it's just exactly from these events that we know that we can learn the most about ourselves and about life in general. And so that, again, for me, is something I would like to tackle and to better understand what is it that differentiates. And so I had once this idea, unfortunately it never came to fruition, but we had this idea that maybe wiser individuals have a different kind of emotional working memory, in the sense that they have just a higher capability to keep different valences active together, rather than pushing one out vis-a-vis the other. And so we made a suggestion, which paradigm to use to study that. And so I think along these lines, and Igor was mentioning some other ideas, I think that's a very good pathway to pursue further.
Monica, did you have a question? Brendan.
The markers of wisdom in societies and how we can improve wisdom in societies. Can you be a little bit more specific about this? What might be markers of wisdom in society?
Well, I don't have an answer to that yet, obviously.
Can you speculate? Because I think this is a really exciting avenue to go, right?
So I think when we think about availability, sort of like notions of inequality in a society would be, for me, one indicator that is not conducive to wisdom. Notions of how possible is it for each individual in a given society to expose him or herself to nature for given amounts of time. how much is it possible for individuals in a given society to be encouraged and maybe even incentivized to move beyond material values. But this is just, I think one would need to sit down and really make this a project, and one would have to have econometric people in there, because then once we had such a list, you needed to actually scale it up and measure it around the world to have this benchmarking
Well,
system.
I'm just thinking, because one of the movement, I think what's happening is wisdom in business, right? And
I
wisdom
know,
in
it's
leadership.
pretty
and
old,
and I
yes.
think, but this would be interesting, right? How would a wise organization look like, right? And I think this goes along those lines. So.
But see, with the businesses, I mean, I have this discussion with my colleagues who are in that field. I find it very hard if you talk about wisdom within a given subsystem of a society that follows certain laws that are in itself contradictory to wisdom. So I find that actually a big problem.
Thank you very much.